denizens of the night. Welcome to another episode of the macabre, the terrifying. Broadcasting live from the slip of darkness beyond your basement door, I will be your guide through the witching hours. Tonight, we shall meet a mysterious relative who lives in the mountains of Appalachia. Or rather, we shall discover him, since he is deceased when our story opens. The shrewdest among you will have already guessed, Uncle Ashford. And was he a rich uncle, I hear someone ask? Well, that depends on what rich means to you. Financially? Not really. Intellectually? Most certainly. But I'll remind you that not all information is safe, and some doors of knowledge should stay closed. This story is called Uncle Ashford and was written by A.G. Hilton.
Francis Ashford. The name meant nothing to Stephen Hayes. Even now, he could not connect it to the vaguest memory or offhanded remark from childhood. He was confident that, until 2 weeks ago, he had never heard it, much less known its connection to him and his family. But that was before the letters came. The first arrived in an officious-looking envelope, which Stephen tended to associate with pesky notices of late payments, jury summons, and all manner of unpleasant things the U.S. Postal Service is so faithful to bring to one's door. He promptly put it away and forgot about it. It was his patent response to unpleasantries of late. After all, if it was important enough, it would come up again. Otherwise, out of sight, out of mind. And what you don't know can't hurt you. When the second letter came, accompanied by a corresponding email, Stephen knew it had to be a scam. A quick perusal of the letter revealed business out of some hackneyed novel plot. It claimed that a deceased relative, one Francis G. Ashford, of whom Stephen had never heard, had recently passed away. And, being the closest remaining kin, he was the inheritor of the man's estate, yada, yada, yada. It was too good to be true, too contrived. Yet he couldn't deny that his pulse quickened while reading it. The notice looked official enough, and an inheritance of any kind would be a welcome thing, a kind of answered prayer, really. He'd been letting things slip since his folks passed unexpectedly, and that not long after Clarice left him for that hotshot lawyer in Orlando. The past months had been raw and empty, as, for the first time in his life, Stephen Hayes realized that he was utterly alone in the world. Later, he would think that it was this lingering hope of an escape from dwelling upon this state that led him to answer the phone when the unrecognized number rang him shortly after the arrival of the second letter. "Hello," the voice on the line had said. "Am I speaking to Mr. Stephen Hayes?" "This is he." "Good morning, Mr. Hayes. My name is Brent Stafford, and I'm an attorney. My offices have been trying to contact you regarding the passing of your uncle, Mr. Francis Ashford." "Look, I think you guys have got the wrong number. I don't know who this Ashford guy is. Never had an uncle by that name." "But you are Stephen Hayes, correct? Your mother was Sherry Regina Hayes, formerly Sherry Regina Ashford?" That gave him pause. "Yes, but she never spoke about having any close relations. Definitely nobody with that name." "Mr. Hayes, I don't want to seem obstinate, but the records do indicate that Mr. Ashford was your mother's brother. With her passing, which I'm very sorry to learn about, you are the closest kin and the affairs of the estate fall to you." And that was how he found himself transported from the warm climes of Florida to the brisk air of the Appalachians on the cusp of winter. The short plane ride from Orlando to Charlotte, North Carolina, left Stephen with a chance to mull things over. In the space since talking with Mr. Stafford, he had done some digging into his family history. He was surprised to find that, yes, this Francis Ashford was in fact of the same Ashfords as his late mother, despite the apparent evidence to the contrary. Mom had never talked much about her past, but what Stephen did know was that she'd been orphaned by a house fire while living somewhere in rural Appalachia. From there, she had been transplanted to Winston-Salem, where she had spent the remainder of her childhood in the children's home and would later meet Stephen's father. As far as his mother was concerned, she had no remaining relatives of consequence, and her immediate family had all died in the fire. It was exciting to learn this news to the contrary, if somewhat troubling. He couldn't help but wonder why this uncle had been excised from his mother's account of her childhood. It seemed to indicate some bad business over which his mother would have a conniption if she were alive to know his new involvement. He tried not to let the suspicions bother him overmuch. Families had falling outs all the time that resulted in ostracization of one party or the other. Still, he couldn't shake the shroud of curious anxiety which had begun to cloud his thoughts the further he rode down I-74 toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. Having been born and raised in the flatlands of Florida, the sight of the rolling hills and deep hollows fascinated him. He found they brought to mind thoughts of adventure, of the grandeur of the natural world. They also reminded him of those hillbilly movies, Deliverance and such. It seemed strange to think of Mom having grown up surrounded by all this looming land and the mysterious forests. If there are any places where secrets are still kept, he mused, this is one of those places. Stephen stopped off in Asheville, a little out of the way of his destination, but a spot he was curious to see before striking further west on NC-19. After that, his route took him winding through the Nantahala National Forest, where the trees and looming hills made him feel more than ever that he had wandered off the beaten track and into some unknown space, the kind which an old world map might mark with some warning about monsters. But eventually, the thickness of the trees gave way not far from his destination, in the town of Murphy. It was a small place and quaint. The main street looked like it belonged in an episode of the Andy Griffith Show, replete with an old town hall and green awning-fringed shop fronts. Several signs advertised art shows going on somewhere, but all was placid and calm on this Friday afternoon, save a small group of people standing on one corner holding Bibles and hailing each passer-by as they went. It was just past 3 in the afternoon. He wasn't scheduled to meet the attorney until closer to 4:30 and decided to swing into an empty spot in front of the visitors center. He figured he could grab an early bite to eat and that the folks here might be able to point him to the right spots. The bell above the door tinkled lightly as Stephen swung it open. Inside, the place was neat and quiet. Small displays about the area's history lined the walls, along with the stacks of tourist brochures which Mom always used to hoard every time they were on vacation. The thought opened an ache in him, but also brought a nostalgic smile to his lips as he stepped up and rang the service bell on the counter. The small chime of the bell faded without producing any more help than the bell on the door had. Stephen drummed his fingers on the countertop, and his eye drifted up to a map on the wall before him. It depicted the state of North Carolina alone, as if it had been a large slice of pie removed from the rest of the country. At the point where the state began to taper off to a point on its western side was a bright red star nearly flush with the map's edge, labeled, "Murphy, you've found the edge of the map." This brought a chuckle. Maybe I am about to fall off the edge of things. Stephen tapped the bell again and was about to leave when he heard a faint flushing sound from the back rooms, followed by the quick patter of footsteps. A portly woman in a blue blouse with long painted nails bustled out to the counter, looking flustered as she adjusted her glasses. "I'm so sorry, honey. I didn't realize anyone was in. Was a little preoccupied." She laughed, a sound that twanged, as did her accent. "Now, what can I help you with? Looking for some good restaurants? Some hiking spots, maybe? We have some great places to rent kayaks. Real beautiful views on the rivers around here." "I bet that would be fun, but I think I'll only have time to check out some of those restaurants. Just passing through on a bit of business." "Oh?" The woman struck Stephen as a small-town busybody, and thus hardly someone worth sharing his business with. But he had questions of his own, and a busybody might be able to give him some insight into this mysterious Mr. Ashford. "It's kind of crazy," he said, "but I found out about an uncle I never knew I had who lived up in these parts. Maybe you've heard of him." "Oh, I do know right many folks up this way. What's his name?" "He passed, actually. Recently, in fact. Man by the name of Ashford? Francis Ashford, I think. I'll be heading up to his place. Think it's up the mountain, place called Overlook Way, this evening after going over some things with the attorney." The woman froze midway through adjusting the glasses on the bridge of her nose and frowned ever so slightly down at the countertop. She seemed to be thinking up a response when she realized he had finished and said, "No, sorry, but that one doesn't ring a bell. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to finish up with some things in the back." "Oh, well, would you mind pointing me to a restaurant?" "Just stick to the stuff on Main Street." And then she was gone, bustled back from whence she had come. Stephen stood for a moment, running back over the conversation in his mind, not understanding what he had said to offend the woman. He left his car in front of the visitor center and walked down a block to a cafe on the corner. When he finished his chili cheeseburger and fries, he ambled back to the rental, seeing that it would soon be time to meet the lawyer. As he sat behind the steering wheel, he happened to glance up the street to where the woman from the visitor center was talking with a portly gentleman with a thick Bible clasped under one arm. The pair of them seemed to sense his gaze, as they both looked back and regarded him with eyes that wished him gone. Stafford proved just as nice in person as he had sounded over the phone. A thin man with thinner hair, he fussed about with paperwork and walked Stephen through more indisputable proof of his mother's relationship to the mysterious Mr. Ashford, as well as the legal side of the property transfer. Yes, there was some money involved, but it was not the lottery ticket sum he had fantasized about. Rather, in his mother's stead, he was receiving a bit of property as well as the home on Overlook Way. "That should about settle things here," Stafford said at last. "Will you be going up to the property this evening, Mr. Hayes? You could stay there if you don't have other lodging. As I understand it, the utilities are still connected, owing to the sudden nature of Mr. Ashford's passing and your arrival." About that, Mr. Stafford. Call me Brent, please." "Right, Brent. About Mr. Ashford's, I guess Uncle Ashford's sudden passing. Was there anything strange about it or about him?" "Strange?" "Well, when I stopped in at the visitor center, I told the lady why I was here, and she got all weird. Like, once I said I was related to him, she didn't want anything to do with me." "Well, now," Mr. Stafford ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I wouldn't say it was strange, per se. However, it was sudden, certainly, and, as I understand it, not natural." "Meaning?" Your uncle, took his own life, according to the records, I'm afraid. A neighbor discovered him. Now, why this would make people treat you strange, I haven't a clue, and I'm very sorry to hear it. I can't claim to have any intimate knowledge of your uncle myself, but as I understand it, he mainly kept to himself, and you know how small towns can whisper. He did, but despite Mr. Stafford's reassurance, this news did nothing to make him feel any less anxious. Instead, the unease which had accompanied the questions in his mind seemed to weigh heavier and heavier the more information was supplied. Overlook Way was situated in the mountains north of the town proper. A gravel trail, it winded its way precipitously back and forth along the mountainside, and several times Stephen wondered how he would be able to safely navigate his way down if he managed to make the top. He saw no other houses out this way, save for one near the foot of the mountain, and he had begun doubting that his GPS had pointed him in the right way when he finally topped a rise and came upon his uncle's house. It looked like a little lodge, with its wood paneling and the large bay window which looked off the mountain and into the rolling hills beyond. The view was breathtaking, and Stephen took this spot to be the reason for the road's namesake. With the way the ridge was situated, the view faced away from town and was aligned just so between bordering hills that Stephen did not see any signs of civilization within the view, as if he was looking through a window into a past of uncharted lands. As for the house, its interior was sparsely decorated for the most part, and it showed obvious signs of neglect. The kitchen was the worst, stacked with dirty dishes and the remains of various cans, which looked to have been Uncle Ashford's diet in his last days. Most rooms of the house showed very little indication that they had been inhabited or used recently. The only exception was the living room with its vast bay window. Here, it seemed, the man had lived most of his life, as indicated by a cot situated in the room's corner. The bookshelves which had been crammed into the space gave it the look of a place of study rather than of relaxation. More books sat in haphazard piles against the walls, some topped with notebooks and loose pages. The coffee table in front of the ragged couch had become little more than a receptacle for various papers covered with strange designs and patterns. By the bay window, seemingly in the focal point of the chaos, sat an old rocking chair of darkened wood. Stephen was mentally noting the oddness of the living arrangements when a knock sounded at the front door. He answered it hesitantly. The man on the porch stepped back as the door opened and nodded his head with its graying hair about the temples. "Hope I'm not bothering you. I reckon you're one of Mr. Ashford's kinfolk." "Yeah, well, my mom, she was his sister. She passed recently as well." "Very sorry about your losses." "Thanks, but if I'm going to be honest with you, I have to admit that I never knew Mr. Ashford myself." The man nodded again. "Don't surprise me. If not for some offhanded comments over the years, I would have thought he didn't have any relatives. Kept to himself." "You knew him well, then?" The man shrugged and looked away. "Better than most, I reckon. I used to do some work for him. We'd have a drink every now and again, too. That was my place, what you passed on your way up here." "Oh, well, it's good to meet you, Mr. Burke." The man offered his hand. "George Burke, at your service." "And I'm Stephen." They shook, and Stephen paused for a moment. "Mr. Burke, would you like to come in? I picked up a few things in town before heading this way. It's not much, but I sure would like to talk to you, seeing how you knew my uncle." Burke hesitated, as if he had been invited to sit on a chair full of knives. then nodded and followed Stephen into the house. Yeah, I was the one who found him. They told me he committed suicide. Burke shrugged and sipped from his cup of instant coffee. He paced as he talked, refusing Stephen's invitation to take a seat and regarding the bookshelves as if they harbored something which might jump out at him. He was sat up in that rocking chair over there. Looked paler than one of them cave fish you might happen to catch every now and again downstream from them rivers what run out the hills around here. Eyes bulged out like one of them, too. Wouldn't have been surprised if he'd have jumped up and screamed, what with the expression on his face. Expression? He looked like he'd just been scared to death. Don't know. I reckoned he'd maybe had a heart attack. I know they said he'd killed himself in the police report. Maybe it was some reaction to all them pills he was taking there at the end. I reckon he could have taken too many. You say he was on some kind of medication then? Another shrug. Said it was to help him sleep at times. Can't really say for sure. He was very private. Stephen chewed the man's words over in his mind and circled around to the rocker by the great bay window. He tried to imagine what Burke had described, the pale death mask with its silent scream, and shivered. Something paler than the surrounding wood of the chair caught his eye, and he knelt beside it. Squiggles, which he first thought were letters, and then decided they were indecipherable, ran along the edge of the rocker's seat. And what about all of this? Stephen indicated the thrown-together living arrangements and piles of books around them. Looks like a mad professor made a nest in here. Wasn't always like this. Happened in the last few years. No explanation. I just figured it was on account of Mr. Ashford getting on in years. Wanted to make everything more accessible. Stephen ran a hand along the spines of the books shelved nearest to him. He plucked one off at random. The volume was old, and when he opened it, he thought something was wrong with his eyes as the words looked indecipherable. After a moment, he realized the book was written in Latin. Seems like he was quite the brain, Stephen said as he shelved the volume. All of this just makes me curious. Don't know why Mom never spoke about him. Again, Burke only shrugged. That's one thing I can't help you with. By the time I met Mr. Ashford, he was already settled in at this place, retired and in his studies. And any idea about that? Not really. He didn't ever mention exactly what it was he was doing up here, and I never bothered to ask. Figured it was his business, unlike the busybodies around here. Tell you the truth, and it sounds completely ridiculous, folks around here thought that your uncle was some kind of, well, a wizard or something. Stephen stared at the man a moment on the verge of laughing, but the look in Burke's eyes said that he was not joking. You're serious? Well, you gotta remember that I didn't know Mr. Ashford for most of his life. Didn't even live in the area until the 90s, so I can't say what kind of reputation he'd built over the years. But I reckon it mostly had to do with his keeping to himself so much. That, and sometimes he'd have some visitors that tended to catch the eye around here. Foreigners, mainly, kind of professor types to hear tell of him, that'd stay up with him. Way I saw it, your uncle was smart as a whip, and just interested in things which flew a bit above folks' heads. Reckon they probably resented him being so different. Silence fell as Stephen took stock of the room once more. Any idea what you'll do with the place, if you don't mind my asking? Said Burke. Not sure, really. Guess I'll try to sell the property, but I'm curious to look the place over. His eye returned to the shelves of books. Maybe the old guy squirreled away some money in these old things. I had a great-grandmother who did that. Mostly, I'm just curious to look through the stuff while I have the chance. Then it's back to Florida as soon as I'm able." "That'll be good," Burke said with a nod. He looked around the room once more. "Where will you be staying while on business hereabouts?" "I hadn't thought about it. Guess I'll need to check in at a motel or just stay here." Burke chewed his lip, then nodded. "Well, if you need anything, and I mean anything at all, you give me a call, hear?" With that, Stephen was left alone in the empty mountain house with its piles of books and its silence. He ended up spending the night in the house. Why? He could not exactly say. The place was no more comfortable than a motel would have been, probably the opposite. But Stephen found himself whiling dwindling hours of light away, nosing through various books from the shelves. He was surprised to find that most of them were written in other languages, and kept returning to the notion that his late uncle must have been some kind of eccentric genius. Before turning in, he gave the house a second look over. It remained, for the most part, as barren as he first found it, but one thing caught his attention, which he had missed upon his first investigation: a door beneath the stairwell, from which hung the busted remains of a padlock. It appeared to lead to the cellar, but Stephen did not investigate it further, for upon opening the door, he was struck by a stench of rot and decay, which nearly sent him heaving toward the bathroom. Dead rats, most likely. He would have to have it cleaned. Maybe get an exterminator to make sure there weren't more. There had seemed to be scuttling noises from below before he had fled the scene. Unwilling to sleep on the dead man's cot, Stephen found a bare bed upstairs, which he curled upon and slept only thinly. He dreamed in his brief plunges into deep unconsciousness, always awakened by images of misshapen human things slouching down a darkened hall, and the overwhelming feeling of something vast watching from afar. "Young man." At first, Stephen didn't look up from the row of tomatoes in the supermarket's produce section. But the call was repeated, and he realized it was directed at him. He turned to find a portly man in a gray suit and silk shirt approaching. He was older, perhaps in his 60s, if his gray yet strangely full head of hair was anything to go by. The man stopped several yards from Stephen as he turned. "You moved in up at that Ashford's place, didn't you?" Stephen blinked at him and tried to grasp what the man was asking. His head pounded like he'd been drinking the night before. If only he could have gotten some real sleep. At last he managed, "Yeah, I'm his nephew. Just up to settle some affairs." The man nodded solemnly. "I see. And what do you plan on doing with the property?" Stephen shrugged. "I haven't figured it out yet. Sell it, I guess." The man reached several fat fingers into his jacket pocket and snapped out a checkbook. "Boy, if you name your price, I will take it from you right this instant." Again, Stephen blinked at the man, wondering over what he was hearing. Then it struck him. He recognized the jowly face. The man had been with the others on the street corner, proclaiming the good word at the top of their lungs when he arrived in town. He had been talking to the lady from the visitors' center. "I appreciate the offer," Stephen said, "but I'm going to get a realtor involved. It's a nice place up there, and the property—" "That property is the devil's playground." Stephen recoiled as if struck by the man's harsh tone of voice. "Pardon me?" "That Ashford was constructing a hive of devils, and that's no secret at all. The place needs to be burned and forgotten, cleansed by righteous fire, now that Ashford's been taken back to his own." Feeling a sudden flush in his cheeks, Stephen stepped closer to the man, whose face was now reddened and in whose temple a vein throbbed. "Look, I don't know what the hell is wrong with you or any of the other inbred hicks in this town, but I think you all need to take a goddamn step back and show some respect for the dead." Stephen brushed past the man, intentionally shoving him with his shoulder, and made for the registers. "Don't tell me you haven't felt it, boy." Stephen stopped and wheeled on the man. "What the hell are you talking about?" "You tell me. Word is you stayed there last night." Stephen shook his head, clenching his jaw as he did so, and turned away. "I'll pray for you, boy. Pray that you make the right decision and burn that place to the ground before anything else happens. Before the eye falls on you, too." It had already grown dusky when Stephen finally returned to the house on Overlook Way. Upon entering, he found the place colder, as if there were a draft. When the stench hit him, he realized the basement door was open. As he stood in the doorway, Stephen found himself unwilling to go further and caught himself listening for furtive movements in the darkness. "Don't be a chicken," he thought, and had to chuckle at himself then for letting that crackpot in town get his imagination all worked up. It seemed the basement door had a bad latch, which explained why the now busted lock had been installed. He would have to get that seen to as well, perhaps when he had whatever was stinking down there cleaned out. Later, Stephen caught himself dozing in the old rocking chair by the bay window as twilight filled the sky. He hadn't remembered sitting there, but the old chair was strangely comfortable, and he didn't give it a second thought. As the stars began twinkling outside, he tried to catalog the day's productivity, realized there was little to account for. He hated himself for being so lazy, but after the previous night of no sleep and all those dreams, he found he was just too tired to get anything done. Yet, he had to figure out what he was going to do with the place, and whether any of this stuff needed to be kept soon, or he'd go back to Florida with yet another loose end dangling in his life. Stephen stretched and yawned, finally feeling some vitality come back into him, and let his hand drop to the edge of the rocker, where it absently rubbed at the strange carvings there. The view outside was beautiful. The last of the blood-red sunset drained fully from the few clouds, and the stars began to shine brighter than Stephen had ever seen them in his life. They were innumerable here, the sky that held them a vast and limitless expanse, and he couldn't help but stare in wonder and feel small beneath them. How often had Uncle Ashford sat in this very spot, thinking his mysterious thoughts? Stephen went to stand and turn on a light, but something in the scene outside caught his eye. No moon beamed down its nocturnal light, but something, perhaps the numerous stars, gave the hills and ridges a soft glow that made him think he was looking at something, somewhere, other than the ridges and mountainsides. Beneath this glow, all lay still and silent, save two pale things on the closest ridge. Stephen settled back into the chair, squinted, and was shocked to see that the shapes were that of two human figures. Neither wore clothes despite the coldness of this pre-winter night, and both seemed to be staring right at him. The sheer distance should have made it impossible to discern other details, but as Stephen squinted, he found that he could see each figure's features as if they stood but a few yards away. Their flesh lay waxy beneath the pale glow of the scene, powdered by mortician's makeup. He bolted up, nearly overturning the rocker. "Mom! Dad!" They were gone. The view outside, though still holding a small amount of the preternatural light, faded to near total obscurity. Stephen rubbed his eyes and blinked to clear them. He must have dozed off. Maybe his brain was telling him he had never taken the time to mourn his parents like he should have, that he had never really accepted everything that had happened in the past year, because, until these past few quiet and isolated days, he'd been reeling in the doldrums of everyday life. Whatever the case, one thing was clear: he needed to sleep worse than he thought. Flicking on a light, he made for the kitchen, suddenly craving a glass of milk. On the way, he paused. Again, the basement door stood ever so slightly ajar. He closed it, smelling again that strange odor of decay, and again imagining that he had heard something larger than rodents down there. That damn zealot really must have done a number on his subconscious with that haunted house bullshit. Yet this time when he returned, he put a chair from the kitchen against the door to quiet his imagination. He was debating where to sleep when he noticed something in the study area. A thin leather volume lay in the center of the coffee table amid piles of papers. It stood out against the white sheets, and Stephen was surprised he had not noticed it before. He sat down on the raggedy couch and leafed through the book, remembering that the top shelf of one of the bookcases contained an entire row of similar-looking volumes. As he scanned the pages, Stephen suddenly knew exactly how he might find out more about his mysterious uncle, for the volume in his hands was not a book at all. It was a journal. He would have spent the rest of that night studying whatever Uncle Ashford had left in his journals, but no sooner had he endeavored to begin reading, he fell asleep. Once or twice he awoke to noises like something shuffling about, which could only be the settling of the house. Otherwise, he slept deeply and dreamed deep dreams. In them, he floated freely like the stars wheeling about above Overlook Way, seeing across great expanses of void and light. Stephen woke with a start in the old rocker, a blanket draped across him, and no idea how late into the day he'd slept. He remembered lying down on the couch, but must have gotten up and moved at some point. What's more, the chair he seemed to remember foolishly putting in front of the basement door was now in its proper place in the kitchen. But he dismissed these things. He'd been tired last night, and probably not in his right mind, what with all the stress lately. Hell, he remembered thinking he'd seen his parents out there on the ridge. It pleased him, however, to see that at least one part of the prior evening had been undoubtedly real: the journals. He knew he needed to see a realtor about putting the house on the market and find out how he could arrange to have the clutter removed. What with the state of things, he may need to hire a damn contractor to make sure everything was up to code. But the journals called to him. He picked up the one on the coffee table and glanced at several of the dates. The oldest only went back as far as the past year, meaning this was the last Uncle Ashford had written before his death. But before he could begin reading, there was a knock at the door. George Burke had come calling again, smelling, Stephen thought, ever so slightly of whiskey, and despite the overwhelming curiosity which begged Stephen to look through the journals, another part of him was relieved to be interrupted. At Burke's suggestion, they went into town for a burger and fries in a local bar. By the time they finished eating in their secluded corner booth, Burke had already put back several beers and was cultivating a slight slur during their small talk. "Hope you don't mind me taking you away like this. I just figured you might need some company. Might want to talk some more. You been sleeping up there?" Stephen knew the reason for the man's question. He'd seen the bags under his eyes in the bathroom mirror before they had left. "Not well, I guess. Got a lot on my mind. I guess it's just overwhelming." Burke nodded and sipped thoughtfully at the straw in his sweet tea. "I heard you had a run-in with the Reverend in the supermarket." "Yeah, you can say that. I don't understand what the people around here had against Ashford. I didn't even know him, but it makes me pissed off the way people act." Stephen leaned across the table and fixed Burke's eyes firmly in his own. "Be straight with me. Was my uncle on the up and up, or was something bad happening up at that house? I don't know why, but something about the whole mess is eating me up inside." "Son, your uncle was a dear friend of mine." The tears that welled in the man's eyes were sudden and intense. "A very dear friend. And even if I didn't know all his business or about his books and secrets, I know that he would never want to hurt anyone. He was haunted, see? Haunted because he hurt someone else." "Who did he hurt?" Burke had regained control of himself, and his voice steadied. "He was poor back then, your uncle's family. Still had a wood stove for heat. He wanted to help his daddy out, stoke the flame, feed the fire somewhat with the nights up here being cold as they are. He never said what happened, but he said it was an accident, and I believe him." "Oh my God." Stephen drank the man's words in with dawning revelation. "He started the fire." "You don't know how much that tormented him. He'd talk about it when he was in his cups, how it drove him to do what he'd been planning." "Planning?" "I don't know. Damn him, he'd never let me know, never wanted me involved. But now he's gone. And I tell you, I don't really believe what the police say about him killing himself." All at once, Burke had a grip on Stephen's forearm and leaned across the table. "I tell you, he saw something up there. Something what killed him to look at it. There was a big storm that night when he died, and I swear something was in the storm over them hills. I've tried to tell myself that I imagined it, but damn it, I can't." Stephen jerked his hand back and succeeded in freeing himself. He wondered what had come over the man, if it was just the alcohol, or if the alcohol was the only means by which the otherwise stoic man could bring himself to speak of these things. Stephen glanced around the room. The commotion was beginning to draw stares. Stephen pulled money out of his wallet and stood. "Come on, let's get you out of here." Burke grabbed his wrist anew. Startled, Stephen was pulled forward so he was nose to nose with the man. "Listen, son, I've been thinking on it since you came up this way, and I done you wrong by trying to make things seem like they was all fine. He was up to something up there, that much is true. I don't rightly know what, but I know one thing. The man was not crazy." Stephen threw himself back with more force than he meant to and scattered empty beer bottles. He fled the bar then, leaving an alcohol-addled George Burke alone in the corner booth, crying. The day passed in a blink. He'd gone straight back, shaken by Burke's sudden and shocking behavior, and began at once to read the journals to find out what had happened in the house on Overlook Way. As he read, the sun dwindled away, and the story which unspooled before him filled him with an anxiety he could not properly articulate. For the pages raised questions about many things Stephen had for long considered unquestionable. Stephen's hands shook as he sorted once more through the stacks of journals on the coffee table. Already dark was once again falling, and ever since returning he had not once risen from the old couch save to do one thing: wedge a chair against the basement door. He watched the wedged door steadily, wondering what may be crouched on the other side. But what he had read in those pages, it could only be madness. The man had killed himself. The police report said so. And wouldn't someone driven to take their own life be prone to fantasies of one kind or another? He wanted to believe these things. Almost could. But something in the writing seemed so sane. The narrative painted so consistent, so damn logical in its way, and he could no longer deny that the noises in the basement sounded larger than rats. He turned once more to the final pages of the last journal Uncle Ashford had kept, passing the graphs, diagrams, and symbols which filled the other pages, all of which he had come to realize matched the inscriptions on the old rocker. The penultimate entry was dated October 26th, 2019. I have finally attempted it. I am old now and weak. I fear now that the thing cannot be completed, but I could not have attempted it any sooner. All my life I have tried to prepare, yet still it is not enough. I have not pursued this thing selfishly, at least not entirely. I know that Sherry will never forgive me for what happened to our family. Nor should she. I will never pretend for a moment that the fire, even if it was an accident, was not my fault. But I thought I could make it right. And yet, after all the years of hard work to find such a special place as this, to build this house, to consult with every shaman, medium, witch doctor, medicine man, and hexenmeister who know the truth of the old things, I think I have failed. Sherry, I'm sorry. Even though you may never know any of this, I am sorry. I hoped to give them back to you. I wanted to restore, even if only in a small part, what had been stolen from you, but it is beyond me. I sought them. I thought I found them. But the things I retrieved from the ridge at last disgust me. Perhaps the old science is as worthless as the new when it comes to matters of death. I don't know what to do with them now. Perhaps they can be restored fully. Perhaps they need to be destroyed. In truth, I fear them. Stephen's eyes snapped up to the basement door. Something seemed to press against it now, as if testing the obstruction. But no, this could not be. Nothing was in the basement except rats. He thought of standing then and ripping the chair away, throwing the door wide, but he could not bring himself to do it. Feeling defeated, he looked back to the journal's last pages. They will not die. Too strong is their connection to the well of power on the other side. For this place is special. I have known this, and yet I have underestimated it completely. These hills with their curves and slopes create the perfect geometry used in sigils and other supposed magic symbology by humans in ignorance for as long as man has wondered about the nature of reality. That is why the veil is thin. That is why I could punch through. The Native Americans knew the nature of this place and avoided it. It is too late for me to do the same. I feel it watching now constantly, and wonder if even now it feeds on my mind. I am so tired now, the chair so inviting, but I dare not sit. Not yet. For every gate has a gatekeeper. It of the lords, who stands astride time and space. Tiamat, Leviathan, so many names, all one and the same. and none close to the truth or the secret name. It crouches ever at the doorway, eternal. And though the door be opened, who can shut it? My dear George, my love, I cannot stand to leave you. I do not know what awaits if I fail. Yet I must try to right the wrong. Stephen stood and let the journal fall from his hands. Slowly he looked around himself and wondered again about this place and the man, his own uncle, who had resided here, who, if a fraction of what the man had written was true, had done something which Stephen could not comprehend, much less believe. Stephen walked to the rocker, the movement unconscious and mechanical. He needed to sit and think this over, to make some sense of it before he went as crazy as Uncle Ashford had been. He was just so damn tired. All at once, it seemed the chaos of his life came to a boiling point, and with no relations and no friends in these mountains, he no longer felt properly moored to anything in sane reality. As he sat in the chair absently rubbing the grooves of the mysterious carvings, he looked out the bay window and saw the nighttime world once again illuminated by that pale glow. The stars whirled overhead, and Stephen could only marvel at all of this as a weight of exhaustion pressed him into the seat. It seemed that the symbols carved into the chair's wood had begun to glow. Slowly, he began to rock, and in rocking, he felt suddenly that he teetered on some vast precipice. A noise came then, but it seemed only a whisper beneath a torrential roaring, which now filled his ears as of a great wind whipping the mountains outside. A groaning and cracking, a splintering of wood, and then the smell wafting from the basement. Not, he realized, the stench simply of rotting tissues, but that of burned and charred flesh. His head was locked in place by a will not his own. He could not see them as they approached, but he sensed them as the stench grew stronger, as he heard their ragged breathing, as described in the journals. Their charred hands pressed down on his shoulders, and if it weren't for the state of their flesh, perhaps the scene could have been a family portrait. He may have even recognized his mother's features in their own, for he knew that they too were his flesh and blood. Stephen realized he could see far now, farther than the view from Overlook Way suggested, for the view was not into the world, but beyond, some place deeper, which pulsed and throbbed with chaos beyond the ridges and hills, and Stephen knew with certainty that the door had remained open, and like the broken basement door, he knew it could no longer contain what lay beyond. On the horizon, it rose from that chaos, the round, a dull yellow shape of the fullest moon Stephen had ever seen. But he realized this was wrong, for the supposed moon rolled, pulsed, and revealed a slit pupil deeper than the oceans. Stephen screamed then, as he shared, for the briefest instant, the same sight his uncle had known, his sense of self withering away before a gaze from across gulfs unknown and unimagined, which laid bare his most insignificant thought, leaving him, in those final moments, exposed and utterly alone in this world and beyond.
Goodness me! We've seen people bite the big one in a myriad of ways in our stories, but I think this might be the first time someone was emotionally and psychologically annihilated. So often in horror, we see scary things physically happening to characters. They get chased by the monster or madman, or they find themselves otherwise bodily threatened over the course of the story. Perhaps a new frontier of horror is having your very sense of self blasted away from you, even as the overwhelming meaninglessness of it all washes you in despair. Ugh. I think I need a cleanser. Time to turn on a slasher flick. If you enjoyed this story, please check out Nightside Tales in the links below. Uncle Ashford is very similar to the sort of stories you'll find there, so please do consider supporting the author by checking it out. And how do I know what those stories are like, you ask? Well, listen to the Audible sample. That's how I know. Please also leave a like on this video and let me know what you think of our new artwork. Whatever you do, don't sit in the rocking chair with the sigils carved in it. And don't fall asleep.